First of all, we could do an entire podcast, Ross, where all we did is talk about what other people do on their podcasts.
There's been a longstanding observation, predominantly for most of our time, was somewhat low level. We got to a certain critical mass with science. We were able to take our domination of the planet into high gear. Radio and missiles and atomic bombs and everything else that we do, and computers. Like, all of that happened really fast. And we're this close now from AGI and all kinds of very advanced quantum computing, and that's gotten their attention. And they know we need to keep an eye on these people because these humans, they've discovered the keys to the kingdom.
Look, man, if you were to die tomorrow because of whatever reason, what do you want people to know right now? Like, what do you want people to know if you're just like fucking gone?
You are not free. And this reality has far more to it than you have been allowed to believe. And God is real.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being with me. The sDm Files, episode 15. Everyone, make sure to check out all the links down in your breadbasket. We put all the things down there. We put even extra stuff in there. It's been a big couple of weeks for ufology. Come find me, x.com/shotdownmine. We'll do the thing together. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with your friends. Here we go.
The key allegation that leaps out to me from what Harald told Jesse, literally in the final days of his life, is that he was directly briefed by Richard Bissell, a notorious figure in the CIA, who at the time he spoke to Harald, he was, I think, the deputy director of plans for the CIA, essentially running covert operations for the agency, went on to become the director of operations. And Bissell briefed Harald into the fact that there was a legacy retrieval and reverse engineering program. He essentially told Harald that Roswell was real, that they'd recovered craft and biologics, alien beings, bodies. And Harald, to have somebody of Harald's stature going on the record saying this, I know there'll be the usual bleats from the debunkers in the cheap seats basically saying, oh, all it is somebody saying something. This is somebody of great stature, somebody of renown in the U.S. diplomatic establishment.
Need to know, number 63, Immaculate Revelations, May 2025. Ross Coulthart and his trusty sidekick there, Bruce Zabel, kind of talking about all the things that went on in April. Of course, they start off with kind of complaining that there's so much stuff happening. It's so hard to put this all into one podcast. And then, we got an hour episode here of them kind of stuffing it all into one podcast. And the stuff that they cover, I wonder if they give you a little breakdown here. They don't do that on Need to Know. But Harald Malmgren is a big part of everything they talk about. Immaculate Constellation. It's kind of like the next topic that they talk about. They spend quite a bit of time kind of promoting, I would say, the Disclosure documentary that is coming to a theater near you eventually. And then they do a little bit of UAP hearing, just a little tiny bit, and they circle back to Malmgren and the Wikipedia deletion controversy. And so kind of one of the main things that's going on here is Bruce Zabel saying, and spending some time kind of going over all the different little pieces, I would say, that he's vindicated that Harald Malmgren's interview with Jesse Michaels has vindicated him personally, because he's been working on, fictional shows for his whole life, really. about these topics, in which he's been taking this kind of ufology research and dramatizing it, and he's been kind of the main hand in all these different TV shows and movies that he's worked on, in being the person who kind of did that thing that took the ufology and kind of translated it into something that would work out okay or well, on the big screen. And so he feels personally vindicated by all the things that Malmgren said to Jesse Michaels, that confirmed all the things that he suspected or researched or knew or thought about, over the last few decades of him personally working on and researching these topics. And so, they kind of go through them. They start to show off by talking about, Malmgren's kind of involvement in bluegill and other nuclear tests, if we could call them that nowadays. Knowing what we know now, can we still call them nuclear tests? But basically, the United States government using nuclear weapons to knock down UFOs, NHI piloted craft, and then go and recover them for the purposes of getting their technology. And, if you paid any attention, or if you've listened to the Malmgren interview at all, then you would know that they kind of go through the whole gamut of ufology topics. And on his deathbed, we now know, on his deathbed at this point, he basically admits to all of it. Really, like yes, we were shooting down UFOs. All the nuclear tests were basically just assaults on the NHI in different ways. Some of them baiting them, some of them not. If we had it queued up, which we don't, but it'd be a great time to play James Fox's The Phenomenon's map of the nuclear test, the thousands of nuclear devices that were set off by the United States and Russia and the Western Allies that were under the guise, basically, of testing nuclear bombs that go all over the world. And there's places on that map where it seems like they're kind of like concentrating, and you see that as the years fly by, that is like the bluegill test and things of that nature. So Ross lays it out and says, the United States government has been shooting down UFOs. So that's what they talk about. So this is a fun episode, an hour and 10 minutes of them just kind of like casually discussing and using the Malmgren interview and kind of the fallout since on UFO Twitter and the rest of the mainstream media, etc. Since the interview, that basically we're treating the Malmgren deathbed confession as verification of pretty much everything that anyone in ufology has been kind of talking about for 8 decades. And that's kind of how they treat it. That's how they talk about it. It's not like they go through his 3-hour, almost 4-hour interview and pick out anything that they say, well, not that. So they're basically holding it up as a Rosetta Stone, really. That, look, this makes Majestic's 12 100%. This makes all the murder giggle cover-up that's documented quite well by ufology for the last 80 years. Verified. And then probably they kind of tie on everything else since then. Everything is the part of the cover-up or the update that's happened since 2017. Kind of tie that all on there. And they tie it on by, segueing over to Immaculate Constellation coverage. And so they spend some time just kind of like talking about the Corbell whistleblower, the newest Corbell whistleblower, Matt Brown, who authored the Immaculate Constellation document that was given to Congress and put into congressional evidentiary record. And it is an 11-page document that, details all the different UFO stuff that Matt Brown ran into basically after the 2017 Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, New York Times article and videos that kind of marked the beginning of the UFO cover-up update that begins in 2017 with that article and those videos and those fellers, and goes until today, goes until now. And so they're kind of great companion pieces. You can kind of check out Jesse Michaels' interview with Harald Malmgren, kind of follow it, follow the timeline of that interview and the events that they talk about in that interview. And that would take you through the Majestic's 12 time period, pretty much everything since World War II, even though Malmgren kind of starts at the 1960s Kennedy era, but he's read in to the couple decades that happened before that by Bissell, who confirms Roswell and everything else. And then Malmgren takes the mantle at that point and takes you through everything since, the Cuban Missile Crisis all the way up to the update. And then we, like I said, transfer and segue over to the update with Immaculate Constellation. And they don't spend a lot of time going through all the details of Immaculate Constellation, except for to say that, all kind of their typical vetting or validation of like a whistleblower nowadays. They say, well, look, he's super credible because basically he worked in the government, and all the things that he says he worked on in the government, all of his government credentials check out, so that makes him a credible guy. And then the part that I think matters the most comes right after that, which is the persecution of the whistleblower, Matthew Brown, by the American government and the media and UFO Twitter sphere debunkers of him as a whistleblower after he comes out and says, hey, I'm a whistleblower and UFOs are real. So they kind of use the fact that he works in the government, didn't lie about his job in the government, as kind of the number one or half of the credibility check marks, and the other half of the credibility check marks is, look, the government and the debunkers are coming after him. So that's, proof of what he's saying is true. And then, kind of the end of the episode, I think the last part here, they do talk about the UAP hearing, and this is really, this Need to Know episode kind of starts at the very beginning of May, and it's covering April, so they've only really seen like the first part of the Immaculate Constellation whistleblower interview with Corbell, part 1, and there's still part 2 and part 3 that come right after this. And then the UAP hearing happened that same week, right? As the Immaculate Constellation whistleblower was unveiled. And so, as far as I can tell, this is the first time and pretty much the only time that Ross really addresses the UAP hearing or anything that has to do with Elizondo at the UAP hearing. And how they kind of walk into it is getting into complimenting the task force congressional members like Burleson, and they want to say, look at this guy, he's really, the way he's asking questions, and watch him ask questions of Eric Davis at the UAP hearing, who, we see Eric Davis, kind of a goofy character to be talking in front of Congress, goes into an explanation about how there's 4 types of aliens and explains to Congress and the world who those 4 types of aliens are and everything. So that's how they kind of segue into the UAP hearings. They talk about how amazing of a politician and investigator Burleson is to ask these really hardcore questions of Eric Davis to get Eric Davis to give this incredible ground-shaking testimony to Congress about aliens. And Zabel works it in to Ross to say, well, there was a little flub with Elizondo and his picture, and he wanted to call it a circle of crops, like Zabel doesn't know what an irrigation circle is. He lives in the middle of freaking California and flies and drives around agriculture all the time, right? Includes aerial shots in the movies and TVs that he works on. But he's confused when he's asking the question to Ross Coulthart after this has been going on for a week or two of what an irrigation circle is somehow. So, they dramatize it, and Ross kind of glazes over it. They don't actually address that, Lou Elizondo, the leading, ATIP director, investigator of UFOs and UFO analyst, couldn't tell you what a picture of an irrigation circle was, and held it up in front of Congress for everyone to see as a UFO, right? And then Zabel goes on to make the point that Elizondo has chosen, it was his point at that time, that it's really important, really crazy that nobody on the planet, nobody, including pilots, which are really highly trained, ultra smart people, have any idea where to go and who to tell when it comes time to talk about irrigation circles that they just flew over. And Ross says, I think Isabel asked Ross, well, who would you take a picture of irrigation circles to? And Ross says, well, I definitely wouldn't go to the Pentagon or Aero or any of those, or even to the Congress. And, so they, like I said, and I think before they get to that point is when they had talked about Skywatcher briefly, and Zabel was asking Ross some kind of like regular guy questions, like, well, why would the UFOs and NHI keep falling for the dog whistle? Things like that. And so he had asked him kind of regular guy questions, and then he said, well, Ross explains, and Zabel asked him, well, the Skywatcher guys are being honest with us because they take an oath. This little oath prayer that they do every day before they go out on the range. And so they are not out to hurt the NHI or to defraud the public of the world of any of the knowledge of NHI or technology or UFOs. So because they take that oath, that means that they're being, trustworthy and honest. And Zabel says, well, let's get a copy of that oath and let's dramatize it. Let's do a dramatic reading of it on the show. And so I think they've already kind of talked about that, and I don't know if it matters if they foreshadowed it, before the UAP hearing, or if they did it afterwards, because kind of the way Zabel and Ross introduce the topic of the UAP hearing and then talk about it was a dramatization because they both, being obviously smart guys, do this very terrible actor job of pretending that they don't even understand what irrigation circles are, and that they couldn't even tell by looking at that picture that those were irrigation circles, not some kind of crazy, alien nation UFO. And that pilots don't know where to go to report things like irrigation circles. So they do, an incredible yet terrible dramatization of kind of like what they thought, or what they've been convinced was the point of Elizondo holding up a picture of irrigation circles in front of Congress while they're going to talk about the 4 types of aliens with Eric Davis and Oumuamua with Avi Loeb and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, the point of all that is that the Elizondo picture at the UAP Congressional Hearing is a great measuring stick that you can use. It's a litmus test that you can use when you're watching people in ufology, people who are covering ufology, as they kind of declare their allegiance to being a believer or a skeptic or a debunker, is how they treat talking about or the existence of the event of Lou Elizondo holding up the irrigation circle picture in front of Congress. And so Ross has chosen to ignore it for 2 weeks and then talk about it with his sidekick Zabel in kind of this funny way where they go about making the point that Elizondo has decided was his point after he held up the picture. And you can kind of apply that to anything that you're watching when you're checking out ufology in any way whatsoever. You can see kind of how someone deals with the picture of Elizondo holding up the picture and kind of go from there. You know immediately the agenda that they're, working on, that they're churning. And so then they go into, from those two things, they go into the Disclosure movie, which you're going to see this week, last week, the week before, and going forward. All of the UFO celebs are touting the Disclosure film as this really good, really awesome thing that's coming. And like all the people went and watched it who got a limited viewing were kind of like, meh, it's more of the same. It's the same thing. It's just new people, like big deal. It's the same message coming from a new set of faces. There's something. We don't know what it is. It's really important that we check it out and find out. And then the end of the show is them really just harping on whoever it is, the members of the conspiracy that are going after people's Wikipedia pages, like Pipa and Harald Malmgren's Wikipedia pages. And Ross Coulthart says, it's even more insidious and deeper problem than even the crazy UFO Twitter believers have churned it up into, because it's not even the guerrilla group that's doing this. He says when you really look into it and run the numbers and crunch everything down, as we see that the Wikipedia editing group has been completely infiltrated by members of the intelligence community. And so all of the deletions and all of the authoring that's going on in modern Wikipedia time, space, is being completely dominated and controlled by the intelligence community.
We don't have any way of really figuring out what's going on. It could just be an anomaly. In fact, it's most likely an anomaly. So starting with an acknowledgement that, here, you have some data, but we have the insight and the scientific expertise to make you feel at ease.
Nothing to see here, folks. Move along.
Exactly. Although there was also political discussion involved and historic discussion. And I read these transcripts once and immediately knew that
Veiled threat?
No, I knew that I was now something else. I had inside knowledge into the deception of our government by elements of our intelligence community. My blood ran cold at a specific point in that transcript where Mr. Rubio is discussing the legacy program. This was a subject of direct discussion with Sean Kirkpatrick in these meetings. And based on Mr. Kirkpatrick's replies about as vague as they were, but unable to escape the truth of the legacy program, Mr. Rubio's response was, well, what the hell is the executive branch doing? Have they been running this for 60 years without congressional oversight? I might be paraphrasing a little, but that's near enough verbatim. And I saw that line and I basically closed that file and had a pretty sleepless night.
All right. You said your blood ran cold, meaning you're pissed, you're spooked.
Scared.
What is scared?
Scared
for your country.
I just think in general, it's like I don't know, there was nothing associated. It was just like immediate, oh, fuck.
Good response.
Yeah.
And you now know this is real. This is a cover up. They are lying about this stuff.
Yeah. At that point, I definitely knew the phenomena was absolutely real. I knew we were tracking it. I knew we had lots of resources on it for some time. But getting to that final step in the ladder and seeing and the cover up is real and it's inside the house.
Immaculate Constellation. Jeremy Corbell, George Knapp, Weaponized. It's 3 parts. Got part 2 and 3 over the last... I guess we got parts 1, 2, and 3 over the last 3 weeks. So 3 parts, 3 weeks. Part 1 is episode 74, part 2 episode 75, part 3 episode 76. So it's big times. There's a lot of good UFO stories in there. A lot. I mean, there's almost 4 hours of interview over the 3 parts. A little bit less than 4 hours. You know, I think the first 2 parts were both just over. Well, let's look. I got part 2 here. Part 2. Okay, well, maybe they're all just 1 hour. So whatever. 3 hours of interview with the whistleblower, Matt Brown, who I said before when I was talking about him, I think, you know, he comes off as genuine, as authentic. He doesn't seem to be. He doesn't have that slimy government feel that Elizondo has really badly, and Grush only had a little bit of. Grush was a little bit better at not coming off as like a government guy. This guy doesn't have any of that feeling. He doesn't have any of that feeling. In fact, he has like the opposite feeling, right? He kind of, when you watch him, especially the 3rd episode, we get kind of past all the nuts and bolts parts and kind of past most of the UFO stories, kind of past his testimony. Now we're into, you know, his story. Part 3 is kind of his story of why he's being a whistleblower. You know, what kind of personally forced his hand. You know, it's labeled "A Whistleblower Honors His Oath." And what they mean by that, what he means by honoring his oath is you know, he obviously must have taken a lot of oaths and agreed to a lot of agreements to get the jobs that he got and to, you know, end up where he's at. So the part of his oath that they're talking about him honoring is that he, you know, he at some point took an oath to America, to the people, to tell the truth and do the right things. And so that's what this is. This is him telling the truth, doing the right things, even though there's going to be consequences that he's afraid of, you know, real personal consequences like going to jail or being killed or being kidnapped and tortured by foreign governments for info. But yeah, you know, you get some good UFO stories in these 3 hours. Mostly he's telling stories about seeing surveillance video from assets that are watching Russians meet with black triangles, and maybe meet's the wrong word, but you know, meet up with or interact with or have an encounter with black triangle UFOs of a couple different sizes. You know, he talks about. So as you listen through the 3 hours, you'll definitely get a couple, you know, UFO encounters in there. None of them are his encounters, right? They're all just, it's him describing video on the internal DoD internet that he watched as he was basically going through and renaming and refiling misfiled or misnamed intelligence community videos and files. And as he was doing that, he found all sorts of stuff that was questionable, to say the least, because, you know, like the video of the Russians that he watched, it shouldn't have been misfiled, and it was. And then when he went and showed it to somebody else up the chain of command, they just kind of quietly told him to shut up about it. And so he switched jobs at some point, and when he switched jobs, he was thinking about switching into a job that would better protect him in the future, as he saw himself kind of going down a path at some point of being a whistleblower. So he wanted to get a job that would allow him to come into contact with more of this stuff, report more of this stuff to higher ups and get it documented that he had, you know, done the right things, and then put him in a position that when he eventually compiled info like his report, Immaculate Constellation, or came out and talked about it like he's doing now with Jeremy Corbell on Weaponized, that he would be credible, that there would be enough breadcrumbs, enough nuggets enough stuff that he was able to either put into place by making these official reports, or being able to pay attention to enough benchmarks that when he came out like he's doing, we'd be able to go find some of the same stuff that he's talking about, and he would be proven as credible. And that the other things that you can't find, you can't immediately poke with a stick, would also be considered to have some level of credibility, even if people couldn't go find the exact same things that he's talking about. And so that's kind of his story in a nutshell. Is he ran into this stuff. He went to his superiors. They told him to kind of shut up about it. He did. He switched jobs. Eventually, as he runs into more and more of this stuff and he's told to shut up more and more about it, he kind of starts compiling some of the things that he's found and seen, and that's where he comes up with his first kind of set of files, his first set of documents that would end up as the Immaculate Constellation report. And then at one point he has kind of these things compiled, and he goes to one of his bosses and he says, look, I've seen these things, I compiled these things, and I've noticed that nothing's been done about them, and so I'm going to submit an official report to all the right channels, including Congress and the inspectors generals, and so you guys can do with that info what you want and need to. And then he does that, and that's his original kind of Immaculate Constellation report. And then nothing comes of it. He notices in the DoD intranet that there's people in there in chat rooms talking about it, that if you start to involve anything that's Grush or Elizondo related, that other entities get involved. All sorts of, trolls, we would call them in the regular internet, show up to, kind of loudly shout down or bring up discouraging topics and events about Elizondo or Grush, and that Grush was especially hunted. And so that's all evidence that he's kind of showing to, or bringing up as part of him being a whistleblower, to show that there's this environment of conspiracy, of cover-up about these topics, not just things that are UAP related, but when we start talking about UFOs and aliens and people who are being whistleblowers or talking about UFOs and aliens, that immediately generates this systemic response that in itself is proof of the conspiracy and the cover-up and the update. In the third part here, he talks about with Jeremy Corbell that, at some point he had stumbled onto the transcripts or the video recordings of Kirkpatrick's open robe hearings with the UAP Congress people like Rubio and etc. And that he could tell when he was watching this, and there was a point when he was watching that where Kirkpatrick was just straight up lying, and that there was an agenda to his lies, and that the entire briefing that he gave to Congress was conspiracy and cover-up and lies, outright lies, and that he knew at that point that he was part of a special insider club of people who knew some of the truth, that there was a vast conspiracy that was hiding all sorts of things, not just from the American people, from the public, but from the government itself. That this conspiracy was a super government, supranational organization of folks who are acting in their own interests, in the interests of the conspiracy, not in the interests of the American people or the American government or the national security of America. And so he knew at that point that he was one of these special people that knew about this thing, then that basically no one else would ever believe him about it, and that was super duper scary, and that at that point everything changed for him. He stopped being, at that point he was more afraid that all of this knowledge that he was gathering was going to make him a target of foreign agents who would want that intel, and they would capture him and hurt him and torture him for the info, and that he would be, this weak link that that these adversarial governments are able to get this info from. And he stopped even worrying about any of that, and he started worrying about, like, wow, the whole conspiracy thing is real. Oh fuck, they say in the middle of part 2, they say, oh fuck, the conspiracy is real. This vast conspiracy that starts with Majestic 12 and parts of the American government and parts of the private industry and the people who went to Antarctica create a vast conspiracy that becomes high tech and more vast as the decades go by, and the Giggle murder cover up works, and we end up with 80 years later these layers on top of layers on top of layers of conspiracy and cover up that are official government and not official government and private industry and not official private industry, layers of people. And he says, oh shit, it's real, and I'm gonna have to do something about it. And how I'm gonna have to do something about it is by figuring out how to go be a whistleblower. And so, you know, third episode here has them talking about him doing a lot of this by himself, not knowing who to trust, eventually and more recently finding people basically through Schellenberger who bridges the gap over to Corbell, who allows him to get into contact with all these other people. And so they are suggesting and saying that they have, 40 whistleblowers up their sleeve ready to come out and talk about all this stuff any minute now. And so he's feeling like, now that he has a support group of other whistleblowers that he's met and who he knows are going to come out and corroborate what he's saying and help his credibility and also say more stuff, that he, feels better in this course of action of taking on the official American government and the official vast conspiracy that has been, not just keeping this a secret, but also developing the technology and working with the aliens. And that he thinks that maybe the Russians are ahead of the Americans, and the Americans are really, really, really worried about that. And that even worse, that the Americans are worried about the Chinese government being ahead of them also. So it's interesting. The Immaculate Constellation Whistleblower has ended up being very interesting and gritty. There's not a lot of, maybe they've learned, maybe the Corbell camp has learned through Elizondo 3.0 and Grush and Elizondo Mellon 1.5, the rollout of these whistleblowers since the beginning of the update with the 2017 New York Times article. Maybe they kind of learned to not dress their whistleblowers up so much, because this one's not very dressed up. He didn't go do an immediate 3-hour puff piece with Coulthart or Jesse Michaels and go hiking and smoke joints out in the forest to show how cool he is, and didn't do any of that, right? They tell the story of Jeremy Corbell taking him around Congress dressed up as a cameraman, and then kind of ambushing individual Congress people with, well, here's the fucking guy, talk to him. And they would talk to him a little bit and then kind of move on. They don't really finish that story, except for that it happened. So the rollout of this whistleblower has been a lot more genuine, authentic, and less polished than especially the Grush rollout, which has turned out to be kind of a big flop, right? So this one's feeling better. We got some good UFO stories out of it, and then this guy. I said in the last things, we don't see anything happen to these guys, right? And someone even said something. Well, Bob Lazar got all this bad stuff, and I would usually come back and say, well, I agree with you. When we talk about Bob Lazar and we see the things that happened to him and kind of retaliation for being a whistleblower, those were the most significant parts of believing his story. Is that why would they go cut his picture out of the yearbook if they weren't trying to hide him and hide what he's saying, right? And so, yeah, like things happen to Bob Lazar, it seems like, but he doesn't seem to be doing too bad nowadays. He's making movies, he's selling chemicals left and right, he's on his third wife, right, or fourth one, or whatever it happens to be, right? He's doing okay. Lou Elizondo seems to be doing okay. Grush seems to be doing okay. John Ramirez seems to be doing okay. So don't have any expectation that we're going to see Matt Brown here get the Julian Assange treatment. But he does seem to be really fucking worried about getting the Julian Assange treatment.
We can do at maybe a lower level what they can do. So we're like them. But they also see that maybe like them too. All of our developments really came around, in my opinion, as a result of collective violence. Warfare. Yeah. I mean, that is we don't like to admit this about ourselves, but that's how, if you really look at all of our technology, all our development, it's all that. It's all based on collective violence, human groups against each other, competing for our extreme territoriality and control over resources. And we fight, and kill. There has never been a period of human history when we have not done that. And you go back through our prehistory and we've done it. Some of the earliest fossils of Homo sapiens and Neanderthal skulls, they've got like puncture holes in them from, being hit with blunt objects and arrows and things like that. Like it's and to say nothing of things like cannibalism and the like, all of that's real too. We have been engaged in hardcore violence against each other since forever. And so they're looking at us and they're thinking, these people, they're smart, but man, they're super violent.
The UFO Agenda, Disclosure and Consciousness with Richard Dolan. The Third Eye Drops with Michael Phillip. It's good stuff. It's like Richard Dolan did a really great episode almost 2 weeks ago now on his podcast, about 1 hour, 40-minute long episode with all sorts of really great charts and graphs of all of the Richard Dolan things that he likes to do. And I said, man, this is a great episode. I mean, it's a real good companion piece to like everything in ufology at this moment. You could just keep that episode pulled up and kind of in a separate tab and on silent even, and then just kind of page through the slides, the presentation with whatever else it is that you're paying attention to in ufology. Just put it right up next to it while you're listening to that. It was that good of an episode. It was that good of a resource. He probably had, in a 50-minute presentation, he had 30 slides with probably the most pertinent ufology info of any ufology presentation out there. So it's really concise and just packed full of the ufology goods. And then he was out. And that included like an intro at the beginning where he talks shit in his very non-combative manner of going along to get along with everyone. He kind of talks shit a little bit about Elizondo holding up the irrigation circle photograph, and wasn't really shit talking, but he said, ufology can't afford these types of basic mistakes at this point in what's going on. And so, I mean, that's like the harshest criticism I've ever seen Richard Dolan actually level at anyone ever. And so he starts with that, does his 40 slides and awesome info, addresses everything, addresses all of the different things that everyone said at the UAP hearing by speaker, runs through all of Immaculate Constellation that he could up to that point, hits Malmgren and the Wikipedia stuff. So it's a great 50 minutes, and then he's kind of gone on vacation. And, in the midst of that kind of like vacation, I guess, he does a 2-hour interview with the Third Eye Drops. And this is fun because it's not a Richard Dolan presentation. And normally that's what I would say. I would say of most interviewers when they get him on and they're able to get him to kind of just do a Richard Dolan podcast episode. they kind of just let him go, just let him rip. And this is really not what this is. Like they really kind of get off into the ufology weeds and discuss kind of every part of ufology in some way. And that's kind of how they start the episode with saying, well, ufology is a subject. It's one of those subjects that has very high levels of every other subject in it, or required to adventure through in order to adventure through ufology. And I don't know, honestly, if that's really true. I think that a lot of the people involved in ufology include all this extra stuff to either justify credibility or attack credibility, right? So both the believers and the skeptics and the debunkers kind of all use it for the same reason, to add to or take away from a subject or a person's credibility. And then they indulge on top of that. Whichever direction they're going, they indulge on top of that in whatever crazy subject they want to indulge in, whether it's aerospace engineering or it's psychology or both, and a bunch of others sprinkled in there as they go. And that's because they want to, whoever happens to be, like this guy Michael Phillip, he really wants to get into psychic powers and remote viewing and the discussion of consciousness. And that's something that we get to hear a lot lately in ufologies. Is you get to the end of the 50-minute podcast and they say, well, and this has to do with the topic of consciousness. And with that significant substantive statement, they end the podcast. And pretty much every one of those, they at some point in that podcast said, "Whoa, Bob Lazar said the aliens think we're containers." So there's those kinds of kind of like disposable throwaway statements that people use all the time to kind of include all these other topics in like a real, quick, like I said, disposable way. And they never go any further. And so Michael Phillip here, he seems to be really trying to go further. They don't flesh out the consciousness topic much, except for to say that they're very interested in it, right? And so it's not really a criticism. It's just I don't understand why even these two guys would go for 2 hours to just end it with cliche, right? That consciousness is mysterious and important. See you next week. So, you get, if you're a Dolan fan, this is a very, very fun episode. It's a good listen. It's not a presentation of any particular topic, and they go through a lot of stuff. When it does get down to consciousness, just like everyone else, they don't really deliver. They just kind of talk around the edges of it as a intriguing and suspenseful thing and leave it at that. Like, what do they mean by that? And what I think the only person that really gets into it this week is going to be Chris Ramsey, which will be in the next segment. Because he's the only one who kind of goes to the next step and says, well, why are we even mentioning consciousness? Like, why do we talk about it? Is this super important, substantive, significant, gotcha thing to say at kind of the end of the podcast? And he takes it to the next level in a piece of fiction, we're all saying, and talks about, well, the aliens are consciousnesses, and so are we. So are the humans. So that's what all of us is in all of the universe and all of the places ours. Isbies, things that exist, entities, consciousnesses. And consciousness in itself is this thing ... So anyways, fun podcast. It's a long one. We got 2 hours. I don't know. I don't think you get short episodes out of Third Eye Drops. And they're always very intriguing, in-depth discussions. So Richard Dolan delivers as far as that goes, and ends, right at that third dial.